Today in the EU, what challenges each party faces ahead of the EU elections. This week, EU citizens will decide who sits in the European Parliament. While continuing our election coverage, we're focusing on the EU parties, the big families behind our national ones, and their challenges. So, who are these parties exactly, and what are the obstacles? Hello and welcome. I am Evi Chiori, and this is Today in the EU. To break down this topic, I'm joined by Nick Alipur, our Berlin-based politics reporter. Nick, today we're talking about the parties fighting to get the most seats in the European Parliament. But let's start with the big family, the European People's Party. There's been a lot of talk around Ursula von der Leyen and whether she will actually secure support from within the party. What's happening there? What challenges are they currently facing?
Yeah, so that's quite prominent in this campaign, actually. You know, the very first ones, I think, are prominently first ones that stood up from her own ranks and said, no, we're not going to vote for Ursula von der Leyen. They even said on the national television debate, you know, if you vote for us, you vote against Ursula von der Leyen. Those are the French Républicains.
Ursula von der Leyen n'était pas notre candidate en 2019. Elle était la candidate d'Emmanuel Macron. C'est lui qui a fait obstacle à ce qui aurait dû se produire.
We did not support von der Leyen in 2019 as she was Emmanuel Macron's candidate, and we will not support her next June, stated on France Inter François-Xavier Bellamy, leader of Les Républicains for the EU elections and part of the EPP.
And I can tell you, I've been speaking to a lot of people in the EPP. They are not happy about what the Républicains are doing, to the extent that they're like thinking, what can we actually do to replace them in France? Unfortunately, there's no one else, but they're really, really angry. But there is sort of like, even with the other members, there's slight discomfort. I do think they will ultimately vote for her, unlike the Républicains. But Forza Italia, for example, when my colleague Max was on the campaign trail with von der Leyen in Italy, they sort of last minute ditched her as well for a campaign appearance.
Yes, indeed. Why though?
Because they're not sure, I'm assuming, how well she's playing with national audiences. So there is this problem for sure. But if you want to hear my honest opinion,
of course, please.
I would say probably her bigger sort of roadblock right now are the EU leaders, which need to nominate her, which have given her quite ambiguous signals, and also the other parties, whose support she needs in the final inauguration vote. So, you know, it's not easy for her right now. There are a lot of things in her way that will probably take a lot of negotiations.
What about the S&D? What are the challenges they're facing? I mean, their main candidate, Nicola Schmidt, isn't the strongest name on the projections for the top jobs. So what do they have to lose?
You know, overall, the S&D does not really stand to lose that much if at all, in this election. But their problem is really independent of the EU election, which is that they have lost lots of national elections and the run-up to the European election. So right now, they're probably going to lose most of their commissioners in the final sort of like negotiation, because that's decided by the national governments, and many of them are no longer socialists. They stand to lose a lot of leeway here. And at least I think Nicola Schmidt, who you mentioned, the candidate, might hope for some kind of sort of post-election deal that would allow him at least to keep his commissioner office. So I think right now this is their biggest problem.
And what would bring the next day of the elections for them?
The Social Democrats are very much aware that their influence is on the line, and that they cannot just play sort of like to the EPPs, so being like the EPP's sidekick again, because then they would basically have no power. They do have power, significant amounts of power right now, because von der Leyen needs them. And from what I'm hearing, they are willing to make that count, for example, by making it clear that they don't want the far right to be a part of the Commission majority. And there was an interview with the leader of the German delegation who said, you know, we have to sort of like make sure that the EPP is not using us as a moral sort of like pretext to do worse things, and we're sort of covering for them by still supporting them. So we need to be able to say no more often in the next parliament. So they are, I think, gearing up to some sort of like hybrid role between being part of the majority and not being part of the majority. I'm very curious how that's going to play out.
Now, the ECR is the party everyone has their eye on, and that is because projections show them gaining more seats. How do you see them positioning themselves after the elections?
Yeah, that's the big question overall, how they're going to position themselves, because at the moment, do they even have a position? That's sort of like not really clear. The backdrop here is that the ECR really just exists because the British Tories back in the day, they didn't want to be part of the EPP because they wanted to claim at home that they're very Eurosceptic. So they tried to divide from the EPP. Now the Tories are gone, and what is it really that unites the ECR? Nobody knows. It's just sort of like a harbour for everyone who's just slightly Eurosceptic, but not enough to be part of the far right. It showed in sort of like when they tried to like come up with a European election manifesto that was all very last minute. They didn't agree to have a joint lead candidate. So lots of problems here in terms of the joint position. So what I would say on this is really that the ECR is probably, because all their parties stand to gain nationally, their main parties, or at least to be powerful, in particular the Fratelli d'Italia of Giorgia Meloni, the ECR really is the prize in this election that's up for grabs. Everyone wants a piece of the ECR because they know there's not much that ties them together. So the EPP wants to work with Meloni, maybe the ODS, or at least they're open to it. Le Pen wants to work with Meloni, she said. Orban wants to work with Meloni. There's also the Peace Party of Poland. There's lots of potential coalitions here.
Giorgia Meloni hasn't closed doors to possible collaborations, as she declared on Italian national television that she hasn't dismissed any options.
Mio obiettivo principale in Europa è quello di cercare di costruire una maggioranza alternativa a quella che ha governato l'Europa.
My main goal is to form a center-right majority to replace the current government and push the left into opposition, she said.
And I think their biggest challenge will be not to position themselves, but to stay together if that is happening at all.
And the far right will be one of the main players in the electoral battle. ID, however, is said to be losing some seats in favor of VCR due to domestic scandals, and recently big groups such as AFD got kicked out from the party. How do you think they will try to stay relevant? Do you see them seeking alliances?
What I would say is the parties within ID, they seem to be more relevant than ever, in fact, because, for example, the French Rassemblement National of Marine Le Pen, they are probably either going to become the second or first largest delegation. And the PVV, for example, the Dutch party of Geert Wilders, they are now in government in the Netherlands. So they have they have influence on the European Council. There is a lot of relevance. The problem is that their party, as usual with the nationalists, is not really, the AFD was kicked out, they're all kind of more of an alliance of we're against Europe rather than being for something together, which has always made it difficult to coordinate around a common cause. So at the moment, it's not quite clear, even if the parties are relevant, if the ID can be sustained. There's a lot of interplay with if the ECR can be sustained, because, Le Pen wants to go with Meloni and all that, like at least, their signals. There's Orban as well. So there's a lot of uncertainty. And I don't think we're yet in a position to answer if they will survive as a group and thus stay relevant as a group.
We can only speculate.
What I would say is a scenario that's currently being drawn up, which I think is interesting, is that the right splits into a far right, a right sort of like that's more in government and more pragmatic. So like Meloni, Orban, Le Pen might be a stretch, but for example, the Sweden Democrats as well, who are in the Swedish government. And then we have the ones who are like the enfants terribles, the ones that nobody really wants, even on the far right, which includes the AFD, which is more pro-Russian, for example, as well. And also perhaps the Bulgarian pro-Russian party, where I will make a fool of myself trying to pronounce the name, but they have already offered the AFD to go together. So we might see that split coming up. That's a scenario.
What about the Greens? We know that the European family of the Greens will see a drop in votes for one of his strongest national parties, the German one, which has been a stronghold for them. And since you're reporting from Berlin, tell us what's driving this change.
The main thing here is that the Greens last time scored a record result of 20+% of the vote. That was never going to come back, if you want my humble opinion. But what has changed is that the vibe has also turned very hostile against the Greens, which are in the national government. There are even physical attacks on them on the campaign trail, as on other left-wing politicians and some right-wing politicians as well.
And why are we seeing this hostility?
So there were some controversies in government in Germany. The blame has been dumped on the Greens over some green policies that many people deemed expensive and unrealistic. And so there's a lot of green hate right now. And so that's probably where a lot of the losses are coming from, even though they're not much smaller than they used to be before they went into government. But it's not the same as last time. And that's why they also really try hard to rebrand, I think, in Germany. They have a new visual identity, but their manifesto is all about prosperity and security. And, their lead candidate, Terry Reinke, wherever she goes, when she talks about climate change, the first thing she says is business, 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 because they want to appear still like they have something to offer.
To remain relevant.
So for the sort of like moderate voters, that strategy is also very controversial within the Greens. But then the French Greens, which are at risk actually of not even getting into the European Parliament, that are more ideological perhaps, they are also not doing better. So maybe maybe the conclusion is just that the spirit of the times is not one that aligns with the Greens.
Nick, from all these parties that we've mentioned, which ones will be the biggest players in these elections and who will be the kingmaker in your view?
So we do know that the EPP is the biggest party sort of after the election, most likely. Nobody, and that's what they're sort of like really proud about, is nobody will be able to, they're hoping that nobody will be able to form a workable majority against them. Does that make them kingmakers? Probably not, because they also won't be able to form a majority in favor of anything without other parties, and they will have to make a lot of concessions here to, for example, the parties to the left, which they say are their preferred partners. The Liberals could play a very big role here because they have a lot in common with the EPP, not quite as much. They try to claim that they don't in the campaign, but there is a lot. So they could become an important player. And the Social Democrats in some way as well. On the other side, you have Maloney and the ECR, who, the EPP might need them to form a stable majority to make sure that, no defections from the Commission majority will endanger Ursula von der Leyen's victory. So there are some players which have a lot of kingmaker leverage over the EPP, which will be the biggest party. So you could say right now there's sort of a balance of power, of terror, because they all hold mutual leverage against each other.
And you already mentioned a little bit the possible collaboration. So who do you see collaborating and under what circumstances could this be a possibility?
I would say almost impossible to predict the exact thing because it depends on what the groups will look like. And if you ask anyone in any group right now what the groups will look like, they will be like, we don't know until the election.
Yeah,
so
of course.
It's impossible to know, I'd say. I can sketch a few trends, on the left. We might see a sort of like new conservative left party emerging, while the even the current left party might still persist. So that's getting very fragmented here. There's obviously a tendency among the EPP, the Liberals, and Renew to, and the Greens, they are probably uncontested. They will probably stay the same. They might collaborate, but then the EPP is not sure if they want to go with the Greens. The Greens want to be part of it. There's a lot of controversy around the EPP working with parts of the right, and if that might spoil a deal. So there's a lot of uncertainty here that will be subject to negotiations. On the right, as I said already, we might see a few new parties, new groups, or at least realigned groups coming together that will also decide if there will be a collaboration with the EPP, because the EPP doesn't want to collaborate with anyone, for example, who works with Viktor Orban. I'm assuming that would be terrible for their image, Viktor Orban, but also the Polish PiS party, which they're always like holding up as a massive opponent for them. So you see, it's all very messy right now and very hard to predict. If I had to place my bet, I'd say we will have a centrist majority again of socialists, Renew, and the EPP, and supplemented by the Greens. But what we can be sure to see is more fragmentation in this parliament than before.
And you already mentioned how no one wants to be associated with the AfD, and the socialists and Nicolas Schmidt himself has clarified that they wouldn't collaborate with the ECR.
We reject all kind of alliance or arrangement or whatsoever with the extreme right. Why? It's not because it's ideological. Because the extreme right has a vision or an idea of Europe which we cannot adopt and share.
Will this be set in stone?
I think the one that many people are unhappy to collaborate with is definitely Giorgia Meloni's Fratelli d'Italia, because and that's mainly on the left, but that might also be part of the election game. So we'll see what happens there. I can say the only party that really nobody wants to collaborate with, and I already said that, is the AfD, the far-right AfD from Germany. They've sort of like were even kicked out by the far right itself. So now there might be a sort of like a rogue group of all the groups, all the parties that nobody else wants, and the AfD is probably the most prominent representative of that group.
Thank you, Nick, for joining me. I am Evi Chiori, and this was Euractiv's Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed or followed us yet, you can find us on all streaming platforms. Also, make sure to leave a review or a comment on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help us a lot to spread the word about our work, and this episode was produced by Miriam Sáenz de Tejada, Nicoleta Yonta, and myself. Thank you for tuning in, and until tomorrow morning. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.